Welcome to Wealth Preservation Solutions. I'm Elizabeth D'Aleo, Director of Family Offices. Kevin Ellman, CFP, our CEO, is here, and we are forming somewhat of a series now. For the second time, we have our lovely guest speaker, Kara Murphy, who is the Chief Investment Officer at Kestra Investment Management. Good morning, Kara.
Good morning. How are you guys?
Welcome. Very well, thank
you.
you. Good morning, Kevin. How's everybody doing?
Excellent, thank you.
So for everyone watching, we're finding ourselves on the day after Halloween, November 1st, which is when we're recording this. So whenever you're watching it, just want to put some things into perspective. So over the weekend, I ran to Target and, just some last minute Halloween stuff. And I walked in and what did I see? Christmas.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
I couldn't believe it. I actually stopped I just stopped and I could not believe it. And I thought, oh my goodness, all I want is some little Halloween decorations last minute. And I missed the boat. So right then and there, I thought to myself, how timely is it that we're speaking to Kara on Monday about supply chain issues? And it seems from the outside that things are moving along nicely, right? We're progressing. Retail is still filling the shelves, but it's not really what's happening behind the scenes. So today, what we're going to talk about is the issues that we're facing when it comes to real supply chain demands, and then how we can kind of work around that as investors and how we can move forward from there. So Kevin, how would you like to begin today? Is there anything you'd like to share with us?
Well, first I want to make a comment that we've been working with Kestra as our broker dealer and registered investment advisor for, I think it's 20 years now. And while all of our clients see that little logo on the statement, they're always asking, well, who's Kestra? Who's Kestra? So finally we have a person we can say, this is Kestra. And we're really happy to have Kara join us as a chief investment officer, because everybody else at Kestra is really more of a behind the scenes kind of person doing compliance or reporting or legal. And Kara's really the first person we can actually bring out in front. So
yes, it's so exciting.
Thrilled to be here, you guys.
So we've all been experiencing, all of us have experienced supply chain disruptions firsthand. Yesterday, I was trying to get some soy milk, simple thing, and there's no soy milk in any store, and you can't get it anywhere. So that's just a simple example, but I know everybody I've spoken to has experienced there's something that they want to get that they can't get. And the answer is always, well, you can't get it, supply chain issues. Mm-hmm. So we want to talk about how did this happen? And what is the state of the supply problem today? And what does the future look like? So perhaps, Kara, you can kick us off with, how did this happen? And how do we find ourselves here?
So part of the story goes way back in terms of how we've even developed this idea of a supply chain. If you think back, 100, 200 years, goods were basically moved around by horse and by hand. Then we had the advent of the railroads, which allowed goods to be transferred much farther. Then in the 60s, we had the development of a standardized size for containers, right? It sounds like such a simple thing, but having one size for containers meant that they could be shipped around the world, put on a ship, and then moved over to a truck, and then moved to its end destination. And then after we have that standardization, then we have the development of technology, computer systems that were strong enough and fast enough to be able to map out all of these different components of goods moving from one part of the world to another. And that started this idea of, you've probably heard the term just-in-time inventory, mm-hmm. right? Companies were able to get so much leaner and not have to have these full warehouses with goods because they knew, okay, I needed 32 days to bring it from my factory in China all the way to here. And that really worked like clockwork. Okay, then enter the pandemic. So if you think back to end 2019, that's when the pandemic was just getting going in China. And so you had the first set of factories that began to be shut down as containment measures came in. So you have the production of certain types of products just came to a screeching halt. Meanwhile, demand in Western Europe and the US was continuing. So those orders continued to be put in. And then just as those factories started to come back online around April of 2020, is when the US and Europe then shut down, right? So then you have this production starting up, and then they're going to their ultimate destination. But meanwhile, you have orders that are being cut, you have companies that are ratcheting back on expenses, and then you also have consumers who are changing the types of things that they buy. So we went from, say, going to the nail salon to I need a webcam for my home office. So the types of things that we were buying really changed. Meanwhile, all those factory orders are already on containers making their way over to the US and Europe. So, one very simple sort of challenge to this just-in-time inventory was all of a sudden we had containers that were empty. They'd been unloaded in Europe and North America, and they were just sitting. And meanwhile, factories in the US and Europe had been shut down because of the pandemic, so they couldn't be refilled to go back to where the factories were working. So, and these are just examples of where small changes in either demand, supply, or how we transport goods then filters throughout the whole system.
Well, one of the things I understand is that in addition to everything you just said, that as demand started to slacken off, a lot of the companies started cutting back. So the shipping companies mothballed ships, they mothballed containers, they laid off the drivers, they put the trucks in parking, and the whole supply system kind of shrunk as demand went down. And then when it came back, they weren't prepared for it.
Yeah. And those are all great examples. And in many ways, again, like these problems actually started even before the pandemic. So you mentioned truckers, right? There are estimates that we have like upwards of 80,000 truck drivers that we need that we can't fill. Well, pre-pandemic, that number was 60,000. So we already had a big shortage before the pandemic. And to your point, Kevin, once the pandemic started, any hiring that was happening got ratcheted back. And so it takes a long time then to get back in and actually recruit truck drivers. Same thing with the shipping industry. We've had an underinvestment in ships for a very long time. We've had an underinvestment in containers. So a lot of times the pandemic was just sort of exposing some fault lines that already existed.
So one of the images that I have, when you go in the newspaper and you can see some of these videos of the port. So this giant ship comes in and it's got, I don't know, thousands of these containers.
Yeah.
And each container goes on one truck.
Mm-hmm.
So each ship has to have 1,000 trucks to unload, maybe even more than that. And then I read the other day that even if they had truck drivers, and even if they had the front part of the truck, they don't have those specialized trailers to carry the container.
Right.
So it's just a shortage of everything. It's just continued to exacerbate this problem.
And think about it, 70% of all goods in the US are actually transported by truck.
I didn't realize that.
No. Wow.
Huge amount of inventory actually makes it by truck. So this has like really big implications. And you guys live right down the road from Elizabeth.
Yes.
It's one of the busiest ports in the world.
Oh.
And as you drive by there, you can see the parking lots full of new cars, right?
I was just there about a week ago. And as a matter of fact, I saw trucks lined up for miles.
Oh, wow.
And one of the ships unloading. So you think about the demand for the actual trucks, but then you think about the time that it takes to actually unload one of these ships. And it's just such a huge undertaking. And then you combine that with not having enough trucks, it's this cycle of delay.
Yeah. And so, I'm thinking about your Target example, right? Where, we already used to complain about holiday shopping being pulled forward so much.
Yes.
Like now it's reached like epic proportions.
It's so insane.
So people are hearing about supply chain issues. So I have like my mother-in-law calling me like, I gotta get the kids gifts now.
Right, exactly. The pressure is on.
So we're pulling forward all of this buying. And I'll give other examples. Like we've done some work on our house and we can't find pulls for cabinets, like the stupidest thing. So we had several orders out for the same thing because we didn't know which was going to come in when. So think about all this buying that's being pulled forward, sometimes multiple orders being put in because you don't know which one's actually going to be fulfilled. Now let's get like a couple months into the future when we have the truck drivers, when we have the containers, when we have the ports working properly. It's not crazy to think that we might actually have an oversupply of goods sitting in warehouses at that point. And so this is where like we need to kind of like think a couple steps into the future about the economic impacts of all of this.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the economic impact. So the biggest effect, of course, is that since supply is shrunk and demand is still high and maybe becoming higher because people are, going back to work and starting to get out of the house more, it's driving prices up. So this is one of the key factors that's driving prices up and creating inflation. And so now the big question is this a temporary problem or is it a permanent problem? Is it going to take 6 months to, clean up the backlog, or is it going to take 6 years to clean up the backlog? So that's the biggest implication as an investor. How do we calculate how long this component of inflation is going to last?
Yeah, and the key reason why that's so important is the impact that it has on monetary policy. So how much can the Fed continue to be supportive of the economy by maintaining low interest rates so that they can keep the sort of like economic engine going? Now, they are more able to do that if this inflation is transitory. And what we think of as like core inflation or what the big drivers of prices, as long as that is somewhat insulated and these more inflationary pieces are transitory, that gives the Fed more room to keep interest rates low. If that's not the case, and these things are going to feed into kind of a more broad set of prices, that's a concern. And then the Fed's going to have to ratchet on the brakes. They do that by raising interest rates and then slowing down economic growth. So that's the big debate. Are these prices transitory? Are they non-transitory? What we're hearing from the Fed is that they most definitely believe that these that the main price increases that we're seeing are transitory. Now, these heightened prices are ending up sticking around longer than what we had originally thought. So I'll give a good example. Chips, computer chips is like another area that's been sort of at the heart of this supply chain disruption. And some of these shortages are probably not going to ease until the latter part of 22 and maybe even into 23. So there are certain pieces that are taking much longer to kind of get normalized than we thought. But when we look at the particular components, the types of goods that are being impacted by high prices, you can track them pretty carefully to issues that were happening during the pandemic, either with shortages in terms of getting the goods to where they need to be or the production of those goods. So we still are very firmly in that camp that these prices are transitory. But it is a concern and we're watching it very closely, and we're probably not going to be through this until the latter part of 22.
So I agree with you. And I think most of this inflation is pandemic related. And therefore, I'm watching the numbers, and the numbers in terms of people infected is steadily coming down. So I'm of the view that the pandemic is starting to ease. It's not over, but it's starting to ease. And that as it eases, the supply chain disruption will also ease. And therefore prices will ease. But I think you're correct. It's not 6 months. It's probably the end of 2022 and maybe into 2023. But as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't mean this is going to drive us into inflation. And therefore, we're not changing our investment strategy particularly, other than including sort of an inflation fighting component to the portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in some areas, like it could get worse before it gets better. So energy is a good example where we're heading into the winter season when demand for different types of energy tends to go up significantly. And if you have supply that's still somewhat constrained, that can really lead to some heightened prices. But again, we think over time that will start to ease.
Okay.
So where do we go from here? What do you think we can expect next?
So one of the key things that we're looking at is the market's expectations for long-term interest rates. So one measure that we look at is called the five-year forward. Like only the financial industry could come up with such a confusing descriptor.
It's like, say it again slowly.
Right. But it's essentially where the market thinks inflation will be in 10 years. So 5 plus 5 equals 10. We got that. And we've seen that move around quite a bit. So initially they were saying, those expectations were staying quite muted. And then they had really ramped up, suggesting that the market was starting to get a little bit more concerned about a higher level of inflation 10 years out. That would be a big red flag for the Fed. And it's funny, I just pulled it up as I was logging into this call, and it looks like they've started to retreat again. So that's an important measure. And so far, the market is still telling us that, okay, we're a little more worried about inflation, but not so much. And so that gives air cover to the Fed. So we'll continue to look at commentary from the Fed, look for that word transitory. That's going to be important. If they continue to believe that these price increases are transitory, that allows them to maintain an aggressive monetary policy. And then one other thing that I would say that we're paying close attention to is wages. So wages tend to be a much more important driver of long-term inflation than some of these individual goods. And the reason is, if you think about it, if you go out and hire somebody, it's really hard to find someone. Maybe you have to pay somebody a little bit more in order to attract them into that role. Just because the broader inflation environment comes down doesn't mean you can go back and say, oh, we're going to cut your paycheck, right? So those wage increases tend to be very sticky. And we are seeing some wage inflation. It's still a fairly narrow part of the overall labor market. But if that really heats up, then that's going to be a bigger red flag than some of this more like goods related price increases.
Okay, so we've heard a few different things today. Something that I've always been fond of, a phrase I've always been fond of, is that it takes you just as long to walk out of the woods as it took you to walk into them. So I think that
That's a good one.
I think it applies very well here. I think more often than not, people will see the impact that let's say the pandemic has had, and people get vaccinated and we want it to be right back to normal. But all of the things that have been affected by it, we need to be patient and stay informed. And that's part of what we're going to be doing here, is to share the messaging and all of the behind the scenes information that we're privy to in terms of economic and market impact. So Kevin, is there any final thoughts that you would like to share with us?
Well, on the positive side, I do want to point out that at least the port of LA, and I think it's Long Beach, have moved to a 24/7 staffing and operating around the clock. So theoretically, that should start to get some more goods moving through the system. And I think there's a tremendous motivation among all kinds of companies to diversify their supply chain. So instead of being 100% reliant on China, maybe they're now going to have some goods made in Mexico and Europe and maybe the US and Canada, so that they're not reliant upon one area of the world. So, and I think is a positive. Who knows how that's going to affect prices. It's got to cost more to manufacture something in the US than it does in China, but at least it protects many manufacturers from some of these supply disruptions. So again, my point of view is that I do think it's transitory, but transitory doesn't mean next week. It could be next year. And I agree with Kara that so far wage inflation hasn't taken hold. So I think we're, relatively safe in that we're not going to see, what are we worried about? We're worried about a recession. So I don't think that's around the corner. And I think it's still not prudent, but certainly we're comfortable investing in equities for next year and the year after. So that to me is the conclusion.
Okay, great. Well, Kara, thank you again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you. For everyone watching, always feel free to visit our website, wealthpreservationsolutions.com. And we'll see you again soon. Till then, stay happy, stay healthy, and stay wealthy. Bye.
Bye.